At my son's wedding, his beautiful, impossibly wealthy new bride shoved my 66-year-old wife into a stone fountain in front of 300 horrified guests. For one long second, the entire courtyard went silent. Elaine sat in the cold water with champagne dripping from her trembling hands, her silver dress soaked through, her hair coming loose around her face. She looked toward our son, not for revenge, not for anger. Just for help. Nathan looked at his bride. Then he laughed. That was the moment I understood something I should have accepted years earlier. My son was no longer embarrassed by where he came from. He was embarrassed that we still existed. So I walked onto the reception stage, took the microphone from the stunned wedding singer, and looked straight at Nathan in front of every wealthy guest he had spent the day trying to impress. "Nathan," I said calmly, "I hope Serena's family fortune is everything you think it is." A few people turned toward me. Serena's father narrowed his eyes. Nathan's smile faded. "Because the wedding gift you have been waiting for your entire life," I continued, "is no longer yours." He went pale. He knew exactly which gift I meant. Or at least, he thought he did. What Nathan did not know was that I had spent 40 years building an empire quietly enough for arrogant people to mistake me for ordinary. And all day, at his own wedding, my son had treated his mother, and me like stains he could not quite scrub out of the picture. When we arrived, he had quickly ushered us away from the main photography areas, quietly reminding Elaine not to talk about her neighborhood gardening club in front of Serena's friends. He treated us less like parents and more like a pair of embarrassing, socially awkward distant relatives he was forced to invite out of biological obligation. I was 68 years old. I wore a modest, perfectly tailored dark suit. If anyone at the wedding bothered to ask me what I did for a living, which very few of them did, I simply told them I was a warehouse operations manager. It was a title that technically accurately described my daily routine, but deliberately obscured the massive, undeniable reality of my actual wealth. I was not just a warehouse operations manager. I was the anonymous founder, primary shareholder, and sole chairman of Carter Dominion Holdings. My holding company owned thousands of acres of highly valuable industrial land, a massive fleet of commercial transport assets, and the heavy concrete structures where the actual economic power of the city resided. I had spent 40 years building a colossal logistics empire, but I had intentionally built it in the shadows. Real wealth does not wear a gold watch. Real wealth owns the building where the gold watches are sold. I had raised Nathan with extreme financial discipline because I wanted him to learn humility. I wanted him to understand the value of hard work, not the hollow arrogance of unearned inheritance. But my strategy had completely backfired. By hiding my wealth to teach him humility, I had accidentally taught him to be deeply, profoundly ashamed of me. The incident happened shortly after the sun went down, just as the evening reception was transitioning from formal dinner to loud, aggressive celebration. It had rained briefly earlier in the afternoon, and the smooth flagstone pathways weaving through the massive estate gardens were still slick and damp. Elaine was walking back from the restroom, navigating a narrow, dimly lit path that curved around a massive, ornate stone fountain in the center of the courtyard. She was carrying 2 glasses of champagne, smiling warmly, trying her best to blend into a world that actively rejected her. At that exact moment, Serena Blackwell came storming down the opposite end of the pathway. Serena was wearing an absurdly expensive, custom-designed silk wedding gown with a sprawling, heavy train that dragged dramatically across the wet stones. She was surrounded by 3 frantic bridesmaids, angrily barking orders at them about a misplaced seating arrangement. Elaine, trying to politely get out of the way, stepped to the side, pressing her back against the low stone wall of the fountain. But the pathway was too narrow, and the wet flagstones were treacherous. As Serena swept past, A young waiter carrying a heavy tray of appetizers rounded the corner too quickly. Elaine, reacting instinctively to avoid colliding with the waiter, shifted her weight. The heel of her silver shoe caught the very edge of Serena's massive, trailing wedding veil. There was a sharp, tearing sound. Serena stopped dead in her tracks. She spun around, her face twisting from perfect, manufactured joy into a mask of pure, absolute aristocratic fury. She looked down at the muddy, slightly torn edge of her pristine veil, and then she looked directly at my wife. "Oh my goodness, Serena. I am so incredibly sorry," Elaine gasped, her hands shaking as she immediately set the champagne glasses down on the edge of the fountain. "I just lost my footing. Please, let me help you clean it." Elaine knelt down on the wet stones, genuinely panicked, reaching out with a clean linen napkin to wipe the mud off the delicate fabric. "Do not touch me," Serena screamed, her voice echoing sharply across the courtyard, instantly silencing the music and freezing every single guest in the vicinity. Serena stepped forward, ignoring Elaine's desperate apology. "Do you have any idea what this dress costs?" Serena demanded, her voice dripping with freezing contempt. "It costs more than your entire tragic little house. Get away from me." Elaine, completely humiliated and terrified, tried to stand up, her hands raised defensively. "I am sorry, I did not mean to," she stammered. Serena did not wait for her to finish. In a flash of pure narcissistic rage, Serena raised her hand and violently shoved my wife squarely in the chest. Elaine stumbled backward, her shoes slipped completely on the wet flagstones. She threw her arms out, desperately trying to find her balance. But there was nothing behind her except the open water. With a loud, sickening splash, Elaine fell backward over the low stone wall, crashing directly into the deep, freezing water of the fountain. A collective gasp rippled through the 300 wealthy guests gathered around the courtyard. The silence that followed was terrifying. I was standing 20 feet away, near the edge of the patio. I watched my wife, the woman who had spent 34 years loving a son who barely acknowledged her, struggling to sit up in the freezing water. Her beautiful silver dress was completely ruined, clinging heavily to her shaking frame. Her carefully styled hair was plastered against her face, dripping water onto her shoulders. She looked incredibly small, fragile, and utterly humiliated. I did not immediately run to her. I stood perfectly still, my eyes locked on the crowd, waiting for one very specific reaction. I was waiting for my son. Nathan pushed his way through the stunned crowd of guests. He saw his mother sitting in the freezing water, shivering, desperately trying to pull her ruined dress down over her knees to maintain some tiny shred of dignity. Nathan did not jump into the fountain. He did not offer his hand to help her out. He did not turn to his new bride and demand an apology for assaulting his mother. Instead, Nathan looked at Elaine, his face flushed with embarrassment, and then he looked at Serena. He walked over to his bride, gently wrapped his arm around her waist, and whispered something quietly into her ear. Serena threw her head back and laughed. Nathan smiled, a nervous, pathetic little smirk designed to appease the wealthy woman who had just publicly humiliated his mother. That was the exact moment the father inside me died, and the chairman of Carter Dominion Holdings woke up. I did not shout. I did not throw a punch. Anger is loud. True destruction is completely silent. I walked calmly to the edge of the fountain. I ignored the whispers of the wealthy guests staring at me. I reached down, firmly grasped Elaine's shaking hand, and pulled her gently out of the water. I took off my tailored suit jacket and wrapped it carefully around her freezing, soaking wet shoulders. I pulled a clean linen handkerchief from my pocket and gently wiped the water from her face. Elaine was crying, completely silent, devastating tears. "I am so sorry, Raymond," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I ruined his day." "You ruined absolutely nothing, Elaine," I said softly, my voice cold and hard as steel. "They ruined themselves." I guided Elaine through the parting crowd of silent, staring guests. I walked her all the way down the long gravel driveway, opened the passenger door of my old sedan, and helped her inside. I turned on the heater, closed the door securely, and looked at her through the glass. "Wait here," I told her quietly. "I need to deliver a message." I turned around and walked slowly back up the driveway, my wet shoes crunching methodically against the gravel. Inside the massive reception tent, the band had awkwardly tried to resume playing, desperately attempting to cover the heavy, uncomfortable tension hanging over the room. Nathan and Serena were standing near the main stage, surrounded by a tight circle of Serina's wealthy friends, aggressively ignoring what had just happened. I walked straight past the security guards, ignoring the catering staff, and stepped directly onto the main stage. I walked over to the bandleader, smoothly took the microphone from his hand, and signaled for the music to stop. The sudden silence was deafening. 300 faces turned toward the stage, their expressions a mix of morbid curiosity and polite horror. Nathan's head snapped up. His face went completely pale when he saw me standing there holding the microphone. "Dad, what are you doing?" He hissed loudly from the floor, his voice frantic. "Get down from there. You are embarrassing me." I looked down at my son. I did not raise my voice. I spoke clearly, calmly, and with absolute chilling authority. "My wife apologizes for disturbing the bride's perfect dress," I announced, my voice echoing off the canvas walls of the massive luxury tent. "We understand that perfection is very expensive. Therefore, I will correct the inconvenience by changing our wedding gift." I reached into the inner breast pocket of my damp shirt and pulled out a thick, sealed white envelope. Nathan froze. He knew exactly what was in that envelope. For the last 6 months, he had been begging, pleading, and aggressively negotiating with me for the money to buy a massive, overvalued house in a luxury neighborhood that he absolutely could not afford. I opened the envelope and pulled out a certified cashier's check. It was made out for $200,000. It was the down payment for his new life. It was a massive, incredibly generous gift that I had liquidated from a private account specifically for this day. I held the check up so the entire room, including Serena and her wealthy parents, could clearly see it. "This money was meant to help you build a home," I said, staring directly into Nathan's terrified, greedy eyes. "But a man who laughs while his mother is humiliated has not earned one." I gripped the heavy paper in both hands and slowly, deliberately, ripped the $200,000 check completely in half. The sound of the tearing paper seemed incredibly loud in the silent tent. I put the two halves together and tore them again. I dropped the shredded pieces of paper off the edge of the stage. They fluttered slowly to the ground, landing directly at Nathan's perfectly polished Italian leather shoes. Nathan's face flushed bright, violent red. The embarrassment he had been trying to avoid his entire life had just been broadcast to the entire room. He lunged forward, grabbing the microphone stand, his eyes burning with absolute, unchecked fury. "Keep your little retirement money, Dad," Nathan shouted into the microphone, his voice echoing loudly, completely losing control of his carefully cultivated image. "I don't need your pathetic savings. Preston is making me a full partner at Blackwell Atlantic Freight on Monday. I am done being embarrassed by you and your cheap, sad little life." The crowd gasped again. Serena looked incredibly proud of him. I did not respond. I simply dropped the microphone on the stage, turned my back on the entire room, and walked out of the tent. But as I walked back to my car, a cold, highly calculated suspicion began to form in the back of my mind. Nathan's angry, desperate outburst had not just been an insult. It was a massive, glaring piece of financial intelligence. Preston Blackwell was not making Nathan a full partner out of the goodness of his heart. Preston Blackwell was a ruthless, deeply leveraged corporate operator. I knew this for an absolute fact, because while Preston projected the image of a massive logistics titan, the reality was entirely different. Blackwell Atlantic Freight was secretly, rapidly going bankrupt. I knew this because my holding company, Carter Dominion Holdings, secretly owned the massive industrial park where Preston operated. He had missed his last 3 massive lease payments. He was drowning in toxic debt, desperately trying to keep the lights on while faking his incredible wealth. Preston Blackwell did not give away partnerships. He sold them to the highest bidder to generate desperate cash flow. Nathan had just secured a full partnership in a company that required massive capital injections to survive. He had to have paid for it. But Nathan did not have any real money. He lived entirely on credit, drowning in the expensive illusion of luxury. To buy that partnership, Nathan must have used something incredibly valuable, something that did not legally belong to him. I opened the door to my sedan, slid into the driver's seat, and looked at Elaine, who was staring quietly out the window, shivering in my oversized jacket. My son thought he had humiliated a poor old warehouse man in front of his wealthy new family. What he did not know was that his new father-in-law rented every single warehouse from me. And if my son had stolen from my family to buy a seat at their table, I was going to burn the entire building to the ground. I drove Elaine home in complete silence. The heavy rain had started to fall, again streaking across the windshield, blurring the bright lights of the city as we left the massive Blackwell estate far behind us. Elaine did not speak. She simply sat in the passenger seat, staring blankly out the window, quietly wiping away tears that never seemed to stop falling. She was not crying because her expensive dress was ruined. She was not crying because she had fallen into the freezing water. She was crying because she had finally, painfully realized the devastating truth about her son. Nathan had not just failed to protect her. He had actively participated in her humiliation. He had laughed while she was drowning in embarrassment, desperate to appease a family that viewed her as absolute garbage. When we finally arrived at our modest, aggressively average suburban house, I helped Elaine inside. I ran a hot bath for her, made her a cup of tea, and sat quietly on the edge of the bed until she finally fell asleep, exhausted by the sheer emotional trauma of the evening. Once she was asleep, I closed the bedroom door softly. I walked down the hallway to my small, incredibly unassuming home office. The room was sparsely decorated. There was an old wooden desk, a cheap filing cabinet, and a single, highly encrypted computer sitting in the corner. It looked exactly like the office of a tired warehouse operations manager. It was the central nerve center for a massive, multi-million-dollar logistics empire. I sat down at the desk, opened my secure laptop, and pulled out my burner phone. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, but I knew she would answer. Clara Voss picked up on the second ring. Clara was not a family friend. She was not a kindly neighborhood attorney who drafted simple wills. She was the chief legal officer for Carter Dominion Holdings. She was a brilliant, utterly ruthless corporate shark who specialized in highly complex asset freezing, aggressive federal injunctions, and total financial annihilation. She was the woman I called when I needed a problem not just solved, but completely erased. "Raymond?" Clara answered, her voice sharp and immediately alert. "It is very late. Are we initiating a hostile acquisition?" "No, Clara," I replied quietly, staring at a framed photograph of Elaine on my desk. "We are initiating an audit, a personal one." "I need 5 things immediately," I instructed, my voice cold and precise. "First, I need a comprehensive, 6-month forensic audit on every single financial transaction linked to my son, Nathan Carter. Second, I need a complete background check and current solvency report on Blackwell Atlantic Freight. Third, I need an immediate title search on every piece of property owned by my family trust. Fourth, pull any recent commercial loan filings connected to Preston Blackwell. And finally, I need to see all notary records filed in the county for the last 60 days bearing my wife's signature. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Clara did not ask why. She simply heard the freezing tone in my voice and understood the assignment. I will have the preliminary dossier on your secure server by sunrise, Clara promised. She delivered it at 5:30 in the morning. I sat alone in the dark office, drinking black coffee, scrolling through the massive digital file Clara had compiled. The deeper I dug into the documents, the colder the room seemed to get. Nathan had not just insulted me. He had not just allowed his mother to be humiliated. He had committed an act of financial treason so massive and so deeply cowardly that it made me physically sick to read the paperwork. The timeline started exactly 5 weeks earlier. 5 weeks ago, Elaine had undergone a minor, highly routine knee replacement surgery. It was not a life-threatening procedure, but the pain management required heavy doses of prescription narcotics during the first 48 hours of her recovery in the hospital. According to the hospital visitor logs in Clara's dossier, Nathan had visited his mother on the second afternoon of her recovery. I remembered that day. I had gone down to the cafeteria to get Elaine a decent cup of coffee. Nathan had offered to stay in the room and keep her company. He had told me he brought some standard hospital proxy forms that the nurses needed her to sign regarding her physical therapy schedule. Nathan had lied. The documents he had slipped into the stack of hospital paperwork were not physical therapy schedules. They were highly complex, aggressively predatory legal instruments. While his mother was heavily medicated, barely able to keep her eyes open, Nathan had guided her hand to sign a massive, sweeping, durable power of attorney. He had essentially tricked her into legally signing away her right to make any financial or property decisions. But he had not stopped there. Hidden beneath the power of attorney was a property transfer authorization, a commercial collateral consent form, and a massive banking authorization. I stared at the digitized signatures on the screen. Elaine's signature was shaky, uneven, clearly written by a woman who was fighting through a thick fog of painkillers and absolute, unquestioning trust in her son. Nathan had used that fraudulent power of attorney less than 48 hours later. He used it to quietly, legally transfer the deed of the Carter Lake House completely out of our family trust. The lake house was not just a piece of real estate. It was a beautiful, secluded wooden cabin sitting on 20 acres of pristine waterfront property. It was the place where Elaine and I had spent every single summer. It was the place where Elaine had patiently spent 3 entire weeks teaching a terrified 6-year-old Nathan how to swim in the deep water. It was the physical embodiment of our family's happiest memories. Nathan had transferred the deed of the lake house into a newly formed anonymous LLC, an LLC completely controlled by Preston Blackwell. The pieces of the puzzle aggressively snapped into place. Preston Blackwell's company, Blackwell Atlantic Freight, was drowning in debt. He was operating in warehouses owned by my holding company, and he was 3 months behind on rent. He desperately needed a massive cash injection to keep his fake empire afloat, but his credit was completely destroyed. No legitimate bank would lend him money without massive, unencumbered collateral. Nathan had provided that collateral. He had literally stolen his mother's most cherished asset and handed it to Preston Blackwell on a silver platter. In exchange, Preston had promised Nathan a full partnership in a company that was secretly bankrupt. Nathan had sold out his family to buy a VIP ticket on the Titanic, but the sheer, absolute greed of my son did not stop at the lake house. I opened the final commercial loan filing in Clara's dossier. The lake house had appraised for roughly $2 million. Preston Blackwell had needed $3 million to secure the commercial loan. So, using the exact same fraudulent power of attorney, Nathan had attempted to cross-collateralize the loan using our primary residence, the very house I was sitting in. He had essentially mortgaged the roof over his mother's head to buy a fake promotion from a man who despised him. I picked up my burner phone and dialed Clara's number again. "Did you see the cross-collateralization filing on the primary residence?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. "I saw it," Clara replied immediately. "The transfer has been initiated." but the final deed recording is still waiting to be indexed by the county clerk. Raymond, we can file a federal injunction right now. We can have Nathan arrested for elder financial abuse and forgery before noon. We can freeze Preston Blackwell's entire corporate structure by 3 o'clock. I looked at the digital copy of Elaine's shaky, drugged signature. I thought about the heavy splash of the fountain water. I thought about Nathan's pathetic, cowardly smirk. "No, Clara," I said softly. "Raymond, they stole your house," Clara argued, her professional instincts fighting against my instructions. "They committed a massive felony. If we stop them now, they will claim it was a misunderstanding," I explained, my voice freezing cold. "Nathan will say Elaine fully understood what she was signing. Preston will claim he was an innocent third party who trusted his new son-in-law. They will hire expensive lawyers, tie it up in court for years, and Nathan will forever play the victim." "So what is the plan?" Clara asked. "Let the deed transfer post," I commanded. "Let them officially, legally claim ownership of the primary residence. Let them think they have completely won." There was a heavy silence on the line. "Raymond, if the deeds posts, they can legally evict you and Elaine from your own home," Clara warned. "I know," I replied. I hung up the phone. I walked back down the hallway to the bedroom. Elaine was still sleeping, her breathing soft and even. Her ruined silver dress was hanging over the back of a chair, a quiet, devastating reminder of the humiliation she had suffered for a son who had spent the last 5 weeks secretly trying to make her homeless. My son had not bought a partnership. He had traded his mother's trust for one. The knock on the front door came at exactly 9 o'clock the next morning. I was sitting at the small kitchen table, quietly drinking a cup of black coffee. Elaine was still resting in the bedroom, physically and emotionally exhausted from the brutal humiliation she had endured at the wedding. I opened the front door. Nathan and Serena were standing on the porch. They did not look apologetic. They did not ask how Elaine was feeling, or if she had caught a cold from being violently shoved into freezing water. They looked exactly like two aggressive corporate predators arriving to collect a debt from a helpless target. Serena was wearing expensive designer sunglasses and holding a thick manila folder. Nathan looked impatient, checking his luxury watch as if my very existence was wasting his incredibly valuable time. "Good morning, Nathan," I said calmly, standing in the doorway. "We don't have time for a family chat, Dad." Nathan replied sharply, his voice dripping with weaponized arrogance. "We have a flight to the Maldives in 3 hours for the honeymoon. We just came to drop off some paperwork." Serena stepped forward and aggressively shoved the thick manila folder directly into my chest. I caught it before it could hit the floor. I opened the folder. The first document was a formal, legally binding 30-day notice to vacate the premises. "As part of my new partnership agreement with Blackwell Atlantic Freight," Nathan explained, speaking to me as if I was a slow, incredibly dense child, "we had to consolidate some family assets to strengthen the corporate collateral structure. This house, along with the lake house, has been officially transferred to a Blackwell LLC. He did not even blink as he confessed to stealing his mother's home. He was entirely consumed by his own greed. Since the property is now technically a corporate asset, Serena chimed in, her voice cold and completely devoid of any human empathy. "The company board has decided to liquidate the asset to generate liquid capital. You have 30 days to clear out your belongings." She reached into her expensive designer handbag and pulled out a glossy, cheaply printed brochure. She held it out to me with 2 fingers, as if handing a piece of trash to a homeless man. "It is a brochure for the Sunset Pines retirement community," Serena said, a mocking, incredibly cruel smile playing on her lips. "It is a bit far from the city, and the rooms are quite small, but it is very affordable. It is the best we could find for you on such short notice." I looked at the brochure. Sunset Pines was a notoriously terrible facility, essentially a state-funded warehouse for abandoned elderly people. It was the ultimate, final insult. You and Mom do not need this house anymore, Dad, Nathan added, his tone shifting into patronizing concern. It is too much upkeep for you anyway. You are slowing everyone down. It is time for you to just step aside and let me handle the future. I did not scream. I did not throw the eviction notice back in their faces. I did not even mention the fraudulent power of attorney. I looked directly into my son's eyes. I saw absolutely nothing left of the boy I had raised. I only saw a thief wearing an expensive suit. I will pack, I said quietly. Nathan smiled, a massive, incredibly arrogant grin spreading across his face. He actually believed he had won. He believed that he had successfully bullied his poor, weak, old father into total submission. Great, Nathan said, turning toward his expensive car. Have a nice retirement, Dad. We will send you a postcard from the Maldives. They walked down the driveway, got into their car, and drove away without ever looking back. What Nathan did not realize was that by formally handing me that eviction notice, he had legally established his claim of ownership over the property. He had officially and irreversibly locked himself inside the trap. 2 hours later, a sleek, unmarked black town car pulled into my driveway. I walked into the bedroom. Elaine was sitting on the edge of the bed, packing a small suitcase, tears silently streaming down her face. She had heard the entire conversation through the bedroom door. "Where are we going to go, Raymond?" Elaine asked, her voice cracking with absolute despair. "He took everything. Our son took everything." I walked over, gently took the suitcase from her trembling hands, and set it on the floor. "He took absolutely nothing, Elaine," I said softly. "I promised to protect you, and I am going to keep that promise." I led her out to the waiting town car. We drove in silence for 45 minutes, leaving our quiet suburban neighborhood behind, heading directly into the towering, glittering heart of the downtown financial district. The car pulled into the secure underground garage of the most exclusive, heavily guarded residential high-rise in the entire city. A private elevator took us directly to the top floor. The doors opened into a massive, breathtakingly luxurious penthouse suite with sweeping, unobstructed panoramic views of the entire city skyline. The floors were imported marble, the furniture was museum quality, and a private chef was waiting in the kitchen to prepare lunch. Elaine stopped in the entryway, her eyes wide with absolute, stunning shock. She looked around the massive penthouse, and then she looked at me, completely terrified. "Raymond, whose house is this?" Elaine whispered, her hand shaking. "We cannot afford to be here." I walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows and looked down at the sprawling city below. I could see the massive industrial shipping yards in the distance. "It is our house, Elaine," I said quietly. I turned around and finally, after 34 years, told my wife the absolute truth. I told her about Carter Dominion Holdings. I told her about the industrial parks, the commercial shipping fleets, and the massive, multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio that I had quietly built in the shadows. I told her that I was not a warehouse operations manager, but the sole owner of the entire logistics empire. "Why?" Elaine asked, tears welling in her eyes, completely overwhelmed by the staggering revelation. "Why did we live like that? Why did we clip coupons and drive old cars when you had all of this?" "Because I was terrified." "Elaine," I admitted, my voice heavy with the crushing weight of my own failure, "I saw what unearned wealth did to the children of my business partners. It made them arrogant, entitled, and cruel. I wanted Nathan to learn humility. I wanted him to understand the value of hard work. I thought if we lived a modest life, he would grow up to be a modest, decent man." I paused, thinking about the brutal way Nathan had watched his mother fall into the freezing water. "But I was wrong," I continued softly. "By hiding my wealth to protect him from entitlement, I accidentally taught him to despise us. He thought we were weak. He thought we were poor. And he decided to sacrifice us to buy his way into a world he thought he deserved." Elaine covered her face with her hands, sobbing quietly, mourning the total, catastrophic loss of the son she thought she knew. I walked over to the heavy oak desk in the corner of the penthouse and picked up the secure telephone. Clara Voss answered immediately. "Clara," I said, my voice dropping back into the cold, surgical precision of a corporate chairman. "Has the deed transfer for the primary residence formally posted at the county clerk's office?" "It posted exactly 12 minutes ago, Raymond," Clara confirmed. "The deed transfer is now indexed, recorded, and legally actionable. The Blackwell LLC is now the registered owner of both the lake house and your primary residence." I looked out the massive window, watching the dark rain clouds gathering over the city. "Then activate the acceleration clause," I commanded. "Understood," Clara said, the quiet thrill of a predator finally being unleashed echoing in her voice. What Nathan and Preston Blackwell did not know, and what their incompetent lawyers had completely failed to discover in their desperate rush to secure collateral, was how my properties were legally structured. 15 years ago, I had placed both the lake house and my primary residence into a highly complex asset protection structure. They were encumbered by a toxic, deeply buried balloon mortgage held by a private lending entity. A lending entity that I secretly owned. Embedded deep within the fine print of that mortgage was a brutal, completely inescapable acceleration clause. The clause explicitly stated that if the deed to either property was ever transferred, sold, or reassigned without the explicit written consent of the lending entity, the entire remaining balance of the mortgage became immediately due in full. The balance of that toxic balloon mortgage was $3.1 million. By stealing my house using a fraudulent power of attorney, Nathan had not secured collateral for Preston Blackwell. He had accidentally triggered a massive, immediate financial detonation. Blackwell Atlantic Freight was already secretly bankrupt. Preston did not have $3 million in liquid cash to satisfy the accelerated mortgage. And because the primary residence was now cross-collateralized with his commercial operations, his failure to pay would instantly freeze his entire corporate structure. They thought they had stolen my house. What they had really done was assume my debt. Exactly 72 hours later, Nathan and Serena were halfway across the world, basking in the manufactured luxury of their Maldives honeymoon. I sat quietly at the heavy oak desk in the downtown penthouse, drinking my morning coffee, watching Serena's public social media feed populate on my encrypted laptop screen. She was aggressively broadcasting her new life of extreme wealth. There were perfectly filtered photographs of crystal-clear blue water, imported vintage champagne resting in silver ice buckets, and a massive, multi-level private luxury yacht bobbing gently near the horizon. They were living the absolute dream. They thought they had successfully stolen my life's work and discarded my wife without consequence. It was time to wake them up. I picked up the secure phone and called Clara Voss. "The 30-day grace period for the deed transfer has officially expired," Clara informed me, her voice sharp and fully prepared for war. "Execute the demand letter," I commanded quietly. Within 60 seconds, Clara's legal team fired a massive, legally devastating demand letter directly into the corporate headquarters of Blackwell Atlantic Freight. The letter formally notified Preston Blackwell that due to the unauthorized, highly illegal transfer of the primary residential deed, the acceleration clause on the toxic balloon mortgage had been instantly triggered. Preston Blackwell now owed Carter Dominion Holdings exactly $1 million, payable in full before the close of business today. If the payment was not immediately received, the commercial cross-collateralization would trigger an immediate, absolute asset freeze on every single bank account tied to Blackwell Atlantic Freight, followed by a total physical lockout of his primary warehouse facilities. Preston did not have $3 million. He was drowning in debt. The trap snapped shut with the crushing, inescapable force of a steel vault. 9,000 miles away, in the Maldives, the financial shockwave hit Nathan with devastating precision. Serena had just finished taking photographs on the private beach and was loudly demanding that Nathan secure the luxury yacht for a sunset cruise. Nathan, desperate to maintain the illusion of his new elite status, confidently walked up to the resort's massive mahogany concierge desk and handed over the sleek, heavy metal corporate credit card Preston Blackwell had given him as a signing bonus for his new partnership. The concierge swiped the card. A red light flashed on the terminal. Declined. Nathan frowned, embarrassed in front of his wealthy new bride. He quickly pulled out his personal black card, the one he had aggressively leveraged against his own future earnings to maintain his luxurious lifestyle. He handed it to the concierge. The concierge swiped it, declined. Serena's perfectly manicured smile instantly vanished. "What is going on, Nathan?" she demanded, her voice rising in pitch, attracting the attention of the other wealthy guests in the lobby. "Fix this. I want the yacht." Nathan began frantically swiping every single card in his expensive leather wallet. The hotel card, the backup travel card, the emergency line of credit. Declined, declined, declined. The massive, highly coordinated asset freeze had cascaded through the Blackwell corporate structure and instantly infected every single account tied to Nathan's name. He was completely, utterly broke in the middle of the Indian Ocean. My burner phone vibrated loudly on the heavy oak desk in the penthouse. I looked at the caller ID. It was an international number. I picked up the phone, but before I answered, I pressed a small silver button on the side of the device. I lived in a state that explicitly allowed one-party consent for recording telephone conversations. "Hello, Nathan," I said calmly, my voice perfectly steady. "What the hell did you do?" Nathan screamed into the phone, completely abandoning any pretense of corporate composure. His voice was shrill, desperate, and filled with absolute panic. "Every single one of my cards is frozen. Serena is screaming at me in the lobby. Preston's corporate accounts are locked. Did you call the bank? Did you report the cards stolen? Fix this right now." I let his panic wash over me, feeling absolutely nothing for the man who had laughed while his mother was pushed into a freezing fountain. "I am confused, Nathan," I replied, keeping my tone intentionally slow, playing the part of a confused, helpless old man to perfection. "I thought you owned the house now. I thought you were a full partner at a massive logistics company. How could a poor, old warehouse man possibly affect your incredibly wealthy new life?" Nathan took the bait instantly. His arrogance and his desperate need to prove his superiority completely overrode his basic common sense. "You are an idiot," Nathan yelled, pacing furiously in the resort lobby. "I outsmarted you. I brought the notary directly to the hospital while Mom was heavily drugged on painkillers. She was too out of it to even read the paperwork. I just pointed to the signature line and she signed the power of attorney. I legally transferred the deed of the lake house and collateralized the primary residence to buy my partnership. You have nothing. You are a loser who spent his entire life working in a dirty warehouse. Now call the bank and unlock my accounts before I have you arrested for fraud." I sat in the quiet penthouse, staring at the flashing red light on my recording device. Nathan had just angrily, explicitly, and voluntarily confessed to elder financial abuse, highly coordinated forgery, and massive commercial wire fraud on a recorded line. He had handed me the murder weapon with his fingerprints completely covering the handle. "I don't think I will be calling the bank, Nathan," I said softly. "Enjoy the beach." I hung up the phone and played the recording aloud. Elaine had been sitting quietly on the velvet sofa, listening to her son's voice. I looked at my wife. "Elaine, I can still stop this before it becomes public," I offered gently. "We can freeze his accounts and quietly dissolve his partnership. It doesn't have to end in an arrest." Elaine stood up. Her eyes were dry. "No," she said softly. But her voice carried the unbreakable strength of a woman who had finally stopped making excuses for her abuser. "He made my shame public. Let the truth be public too." I nodded, opened my secure email client, and forwarded the audio file to Clara. "Prepare the federal dossier," I typed. "The weapon is fully loaded." While Nathan was screaming at the concierge in the Maldives, his new father-in-law was experiencing an entirely different level of catastrophic humiliation. Preston Blackwell had driven his expensive, chauffeur-driven luxury SUV to his massive flagship warehouse facility on the industrial side of the city, desperate to figure out why his corporate accounts were suddenly frozen. When his SUV pulled up to the main entrance, Preston immediately realized the severity of his situation. The massive steel gates of the warehouse were chained shut. 4 heavily armed private security contractors were standing outside, accompanied by 2 grim-faced federal marshals. Preston jumped out of his SUV, his face flushed with rage. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, storming up to the federal marshals. "This is my facility. I am Preston Blackwell. Open these gates immediately." One of the private security contractors, a massive man wearing a tactical vest, stepped forward and handed Preston a thick legal document. "You are severely delinquent on 3 months of commercial rent, Mr. Blackwell," the contractor stated flatly, completely unimpressed by Preston's expensive suit. "Furthermore, the toxic balloon mortgage attached to your newly acquired collateral has been aggressively accelerated due to an unauthorized deed transfer." Preston stared at the document, his heart dropping into his stomach. "Who authorized this lockout?" Preston demanded, his voice shaking as the reality of his bankruptcy finally crashed down on him. "The owner of the facility," the contractor replied. "Carter Dominion Holdings." Preston's eyes widened in absolute shock. He had spent years leasing warehouses from the anonymous, incredibly powerful Carter Dominion Holdings, always assuming it was run by a faceless, offshore billionaire. He had desperately tried to secure a meeting with the chairman for years to renegotiate his failing leases, but his requests had always been ignored. Now, that same anonymous billionaire had just seized his entire inventory, impounded his massive fleet of commercial trucks, locked his employees out of the servers, and effectively shut down his entire fake logistics empire in a single morning. Preston frantically pulled out his smartphone and opened his email client. He drafted a desperate, pathetic email to the generic legal contact address for Carter Dominion Holdings. To the chairman of Carter Dominion Holdings, Preston wrote, his hands shaking so violently he could barely type. "There has been a massive misunderstanding regarding the commercial collateral. Please, I am begging you, allow me to come to your office and explain. We can resolve this quietly. Please do not destroy my company." I was sitting in my penthouse, drinking my coffee, when Clara forwarded Preston's desperate email to my Secure's inbox. I read the pathetic, groveling words of the man who had allowed his spoiled daughter to shove my wife into a stone fountain. I smiled, a cold, hard smile that did not reach my eyes. Preston Blackwell was begging the man he had mocked at his daughter's wedding to unlock the doors of his empire. He wanted a meeting. I was going to give him an execution. Preston Blackwell, accompanied by a thoroughly panicked Nathan and a furiously silent Serena, arrived at the towering, glass-walled headquarters of Carter Dominion Holdings exactly 48 hours later. They had flown back from the Maldives in absolute disgrace, flying commercial coach because every single one of their credit cards was permanently frozen. They were broke, desperate, and entirely at the mercy of the anonymous billionaire who had just seized their entire fake empire. A silent, heavily armed private security escort led them onto a private elevator and took them to the top floor of the tower. They were ushered into a massive corporate boardroom. They were not alone. I had specifically invited the primary creditors of Blackwell Atlantic Freight, 3 key board members and 2 major international clients. They sat silently along the edges of the room, acting as the corporate audience for an execution. At the far end of the colossal mahogany table, a single high-backed leather CEO chair was turned completely away from them. Preston nervously straightened his tie. He was sweating profusely, his arrogant corporate swagger completely replaced by the terrifying realization that he was about to face financial ruin. Nathan stood behind him, looking exhausted and terrified. Serena stood slightly apart from her new husband, her arms crossed, glaring at him with absolute contempt for ruining her luxurious honeymoon. "Thank you for agreeing to see me, Mr. Chairman," Preston began, his voice shaking slightly as he addressed the back of the leather chair. "I assure you, the delay in our commercial lease payments was a simple administrative oversight. And regarding the accelerated mortgage on the residential collateral, I am confident we can restructure the debt to your complete satisfaction. We just need a little more time." The heavy leather chair slowly spun around. I was sitting in it. I was not wearing the cheap faded polo shirts I used to wear around my quiet suburban neighborhood. I was wearing a sharply tailored, aggressive charcoal suit. I did not look like a poor old warehouse operations manager. I looked exactly like the man who owned the entire building. Preston Blackwell stopped speaking instantly. His jaw literally dropped open in shock. Nathan took a physical step backward, his eyes widening in paralyzing terror. He looked at me, then looked around the massive boardroom, desperately trying to comprehend how his poor, embarrassing father had somehow broken into the chairman's office. Serena went completely pale, finally realizing that the old man she had sneered at during her wedding was not a peasant. "Welcome to my office, Preston," I said, my voice projecting across the long mahogany table with undeniable authority. "Let's talk about your debt." Preston's mind desperately tried to process the impossible reality sitting in front of him. "Raymond?" Preston stammered, his eyes darting frantically around the room. "What are you doing here? Where is the chairman of Carter Dominion Holdings?" "I am the chairman of Carter Dominion Holdings, Preston," I replied coldly, leaning forward in my chair. "And you are currently trespassing in my building." I opened a thick black leather folder resting on my desk and slid it forcefully across the polished mahogany table. It stopped directly in front of Preston. "Inside that folder," I announced, "is the complete, unredacted federal dossier my legal team has compiled against your organization." Preston's shaking hands opened the folder. "It contains the commercial lease agreements proving my holding company owns every single warehouse you operate," I explained, listing the charges like a judge reading a death sentence. "It contains the toxic balloon mortgage acceleration clause you failed to read. It contains the financial audit proving you are secretly bankrupt. And, most importantly, it contains the fraudulent power of attorney your new son-in-law used to steal my home and offer it to you as illegal collateral." Nathan let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. "You tried to steal a house, Nathan," I said, shifting my cold gaze directly to my son, "from a man who owned the ground beneath your father-in-law's company." Serena turned and looked at Nathan, her face twisting with absolute disgust. She finally understood the entire pathetic truth. Nathan was not a wealthy partner. He was a broke, desperate fraud who had stolen from his own parents, and Preston was a bankrupt failure. "You lied to me." Serena screamed at Nathan, her voice echoing shrilly in the boardroom. "You told me you were rich. You told me your father was just a stupid warehouse clerk." Without a moment of hesitation, Serena raised her hand and slapped Nathan violently across the face. The sharp crack echoed through the room. It was a perfectly poetic echo of the brutal shove she had delivered to Elaine at the fountain. Nathan stumbled backward, holding his stinging cheek, tears streaming down his face. "Dad, please," Nathan begged, completely ignoring his furious bride. "I am your son. You cannot do this to me. I made a mistake. I was just trying to build a future. You can stop this." "Tell them it was a misunderstanding." I did not answer him. Instead, I pressed a single button on my desk console. The digital audio recording from the Maldives played over the boardroom's high-fidelity speakers. "I outsmarted you. I brought the notary directly to the hospital, while Mom was heavily drugged on painkillers. She was too out of it to even read the paperwork. I just pointed to the signature line, and she signed the power of attorney. Nathan's own arrogant, shrieking voice filled the room, legally sealing his fate. He collapsed to his knees, burying his face in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Preston Blackwell fell backward into a leather chair, staring blankly at the ceiling. Realizing that he was not just going to lose his company, he was going to federal prison, the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. Clara Voss walked in, looking sharp, terrifying, and completely in control. She was flanked by 4 grim-faced federal agents wearing dark suits and carrying handcuffs. Clara stepped aside. One of the federal agents opened a thick file and looked directly at my son and his father-in-law. "Nathan Carter, Preston Blackwell, you are under arrest," the agent stated. His voice ringing clearly in the silent boardroom. The agents moved swiftly. They pulled Nathan up from the floor, snapping the cold steel handcuffs around his wrists. They did the same to Preston. Wire fraud, elder financial abuse, forgery, grand larceny, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Clara listed the charges, her voice devoid of any sympathy. "You are both facing charges that could measure your sentences in decades." As the agents prepared to march them out of the room, the boardroom doors opened one final time. Elaine walked in. She was no longer the frightened, humiliated woman sitting in a freezing fountain in a ruined silver dress. She was wearing a stunning, flawlessly tailored designer suit. Her hair was perfectly styled. She stood incredibly tall, projecting the quiet, undeniable dignity of a woman who finally understood her own absolute worth. "Mom!" Nathan screamed, thrashing desperately against the grip of the federal agents. "Mom, please, help me. Tell them you gave me the house. Tell them it was a gift. Please, Mom, I love you." Elaine walked slowly across the room. She did not look at the federal agents. She did not look at Preston. She stopped directly in front of Nathan and Serena. She looked at the son she had spent her entire life trying to protect. She looked at the woman who had shoved her into the water. Nathan stared at her with desperate, pleading eyes, begging for the unconditional forgiveness he had exploited for 34 years. Elaine looked at him, her expression perfectly calm, completely devoid of any remaining maternal weakness. "A son who laughs when his mother falls has already chosen where he belongs," Elaine said very softly. She turned her back on him and walked over to stand beside me. The agents marched Nathan and Preston out of the boardroom in handcuffs. Serena was left standing completely alone in the massive room, broke, disgraced, and utterly irrelevant. In the aftermath, the justice system showed no mercy. Nathan was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Preston Blackwell lost his entire fake empire. His personal assets were liquidated to pay his massive debts, and he joined his son-in-law behind bars. Serena faced her own brutal reality. The security footage of her violently shoving Elaine into the fountain leaked online, going massively viral. Her wealthy friends instantly abandoned her. Luxury brands publicly cut ties. Stripped of her status and facing a crushing civil lawsuit from Clara's legal team, Serena was forced to sell her designer bags and jewelry just to afford a cheap apartment and a mid-tier defense attorney. Elaine and I sold the modest suburban house to a kind, hard-working young family for a fraction of its market value. We did not need the money. We permanently cut Nathan entirely out of the family trust, redirecting the massive fortune into an elder abuse foundation and a series of educational scholarships for underprivileged children. We moved out of the city, purchasing a massive, beautiful countryside estate surrounded by quiet, rolling green hills and deep, peaceful lakes. A year later, Elaine and I were walking through the sprawling gardens of our new estate. The sun was shining warmly, and the only sound was the gentle rustling of the leaves in the wind. I looked at my wife, holding her hand, finally living the life we had both earned. I spent my life hiding my power to teach my son humility. I thought quietly, watching the wind sweep across the deep, calm water of the lake. In the end, He mistook humility for weakness. That was the most expensive mistake he ever made.